Reserve Bank Governor Lesetja Kganyago says that the central bank could consider raising its benchmark interest rate by half a percentage point for a second consecutive meeting in July. The inflation rate surged above the central bank's 3 to 6% target range for the first time in May. That was in more than 5 years, in fact, raising the prospect of more aggressive interest rate hikes this year. Let's talk about the situation with Economist Azar Jammine. Good to have you on the show, sir, this afternoon. So, another rate hike likely. Is it avoidable?
I suppose it is avoidable. I mean, the Reserve Bank's not obliged to raise the interest rate by 0.5%, but in light of the much higher than anticipated inflation figures that we've received for May, with this morning's figure of producer price inflation at 14.7% from 13.1% in April, way above expectations, I think that there is little chance that we will avoid a 0.5% further increase in the repo rate in July, and may well have a further 0.5% above that in September at the MPC meeting in September.
So I asked you if it was avoidable. Based on what you just said now, is it absolutely necessary, would you say?
It's absolutely necessary because with inflation rising the way it's done, we've already seen the impact that this is having on wage negotiations and the manner in which trade unions have been pressing for very big wage increases. And in fact, they've been awarded now by Eskom has offered 7% increase. We've seen Sibanye-Stillwater giving a 7.5% increase. And, if wages start accelerating at that kind of pace, then there's two possible outcomes. Either that the employer lays off workers and gives those who remain in their jobs a very big pay increase, or that inflation will rise substantially. And the Reserve Bank is obliged to send a warning signal by raising interest rates.
Are we then, Dr. Jammine, going to go to a long-term sort of picture or period of these rates? Because I recall at the start of the pandemic that had been put off quite a few times, but even then there was a warning that when the floodgates sort of open, we would be in for the long haul.
Unfortunately, the floodgates have indeed opened, and this is a worldwide phenomenon, exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. Inflation has risen around the world by far more than had been anticipated. It's not entirely surprising. The amount of liquidity created globally to fight off the ravages of the COVID pandemic and to provide relief to people afflicted by the lockdowns was extraordinary. And initially it didn't feed through into higher prices, but now we're seeing the full impact really hitting home, and there's a price to pay, unfortunately.
And what can be done to cushion the blow for ordinary South Africans, the poor and the middle class specifically?
The government has the option, and governments in some countries have actually done that, to provide subsidies for a variety of goods. In other words, and to some extent, the government here has already done that by reducing the fuel levy for a couple of months in order to cushion the impact of higher fuel prices. And they could probably introduce subsidies on the prices of bread and a whole lot of other foodstuffs whose prices are set to rise quite substantially. But that comes again at a cost to the fiscus, and eventually taxpayers have to bear the brunt, and so it comes back to haunt one longer term. So really the choice is between taking the pain now or waiting and taking an even greater pain later on.
I'm glad you mentioned the issue of the fuel price, because there are predictions that we're likely to see another steep one around this time next week, more than R2 for a litre of petrol. There's another round of calls now for government to extend the fuel levy relief, but that has always been, or had always been, confirmed as an interim measure. When you look at the situation now, do you think a recalculation of the fuel price is what's going to be the ultimate savior for us?
No, the fact is we cannot get away from the fact that globally oil prices have surged as a result of supply shortages, created in part exacerbated by the sanctions imposed on Russia, but this started long before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. What we are now seeing is that for several years now, a lot of businesses who would normally have been investing in new oil and coal and gas supplies have been refraining from doing so because there's been this worldwide movement to move towards cleaner energy and away from carbon sources of energy. But in the interim, the world hasn't adjusted sufficiently, the economy hasn't adjusted sufficiently to actually accommodate renewable energy and nuclear energy. You don't see electric cars all over the place yet. And so we're still dependent on oil and coal. And there's a shortage now because we haven't invested in new supplies for a long period of time.
Let's go back to the central bank, the Monetary Policy Committee specifically, because every time we hear of a rates increase, some of the reaction is that the bank is very much conservative, very academic in its approach to determining which direction to move, rather than a realistic, shall we say, assessment of the lived experience of South Africans, how people will cope with a rate increase, whether or not it is what is best in terms of economic technicality. Do you think that's fair criticism?
No, I don't think it's fair criticism. Such criticism actually overlooks the role of a central bank in containing inflation, which ultimately, if it gets out of control, is going to be far more detrimental to the ordinary consumer, and especially to the poorer consumer, than taking the pain right now as a result of what are global factors that are beyond the control of the South African consumer. They have, everyone around the world is taking the pain from this. In some countries, fuel prices are at over 40 rand a litre. Those consumers are also taking the pain massively.
Azar Jammine, good to have your time as always, so thank you.